I want to thank you all for making the effort to be here today and wish to greet you the way Muslims do. Assalamu alaikum. May God's peace be upon you. This event has been put together by Aware Muslim and McMaster Muslims for Peace and Justice. Aware Muslim is a grassroots initiative dedicated to exploring the Islamic perspective to modern economic, social, political, and intellectual challenges. We aim to create a space where Muslims can strive to be devout in their spiritual convictions while striving for a just social order. Really, we see no contradiction between those two goals. We have gathered today to talk about the structural injustice faced by Black Americans on a daily basis. I won't go into describing this, that's our speakers' jobs. But I do want to say one thing. We are a Muslim group and we are seeking to find lessons in the experience of Black America. This does not mean we are seeking in any way to compare the suffering and oppression faced by African Americans compared with what Muslims are going through today. Such a comparison will be insulting and we will be foolish to make it. We are simply trying to see how the same elite that have subjugated African Americans for centuries may use the same tools against our communities, including Muslims. Thanks once again for being here. Let me introduce our speakers. First, Abdul Qadir Farah. Abdul Qadir is an activist in the Muslim community. His focus is analyzing the systems of racialized oppression faced by Black community in North America. And has extensively researched the issue. He stays abreast of anti-discrimination movements such as Black Lives Matter. He also serves as a member of a social service committee at the Mountain Mosque, while volunteering at the Hamilton Downtown Mosque. He also has the privilege of being my younger brother. The next speaker is Muhammad Ibrahim. Muhammad has been a youth worker and Islamic activist for the past few years. He has volunteered at local mosques, building our youth programs, and has a neat focus on being a role model for younger people. He's also a student of Islamic knowledge with a particular focus on the systems of Islam. He is a Harden Arsenal fan and has made the mistake of going to Sheridan College. Without further ado, let me pass the mic to my brother, Abdul Qadir.
Hello, everybody. As you heard, my name is Abdul Qadir, and I'd like to add my thanks to that. I'd like to thank McMaster University for allowing us to be here today. And I'd like to thank MMPJ for making this event possible, for giving us this room here today. And most of all, I'd like to thank you guys here that are in attendance for taking time out of your day and coming here to listen to us speak about a very complicated issue, and an issue that causes a lot of people to have a knee-jerk reaction to it. So without further ado, today we're going to be talking about oppression as it relates to the Black community in America. We're going to analyze it structurally, and what we're going to try to prove here today is not just about a matter of individual bias in America. We're going to go deeper than that. So the issue that we're going to discuss today is police brutality and a lot of the practices in America that they use against the Black community. Also, racial bias in the criminal justice system. So what happens in the court system, what happens with the prosecutors, and what happens when people find themselves convicted of a crime. Then we're going to talk about mass incarceration, how people find themselves in the system of mass incarceration, why is there so many large numbers of people, minorities, ethnic minorities that find themselves in jails. Then we're going to go into a brief history of America, because this part's important. This part is going to illustrate that the problem is not just a matter of individual bias. It has a lot more to do with the prevailing system, which is capitalism. Then we're going to come back and we're going to make the link. We're going to make the link to the contemporary system of mass incarceration today. So I'd like to start off and say that when it comes to race, it's actually impossible for all of us to come into this issue of race on the same level. And that's for some obvious reasons. Because we all have our own personal experiences, we all have our own set of beliefs, and we all been raised differently. And when it comes to personal experiences, when it comes to American people in particular, American Black people, their personal experiences with race and police in the criminal justice system has been that of loss and misery. And we've seen that with the death of Walter Scott. A man, he was shot in the back on camera by a police officer as he tried to create some distance between them. If this wasn't caught on camera, this would have been another stat. And we also seen in this video that this police officer tried to plant some evidence to make it seem like Walter Scott was deserving of his fate, like we see in many of the cases in America. We also seen this in the death of Eric Gardner, an asthmatic man who was choked to death on camera as he was screaming, "I can't breathe," because he was trying to sell some loose cigarettes on a street corner. We also seen this in the shooting death of Laquan McDonald, a teenage boy who was also killed on camera, 16 bullets ripping into his lifeless body. And we've seen this as well in the death of Samuel DuBose. He was shot in the head. This footage was caught on the police body camera, and he was shot in the head. First reaction the police officer had as he tried to drive away while the police officer was wrongfully trying to open his car was just to shoot him in the head, and he died instantly. And we also seen this in the death of Freddie Gray, who was abducted off a street corner in Baltimore in perfect health, later to be found deceased in custody. And this caused the uprising in Baltimore, and people, they got together to show their frustration because they had enough of the treatment of black people in Baltimore. And we also seen this in the death of Tamir Rice, 12-year-old boy in Cleveland, Ohio, who was shot on camera while he was playing with a toy gun, like many of us done growing up. What's important to note here is that in Cleveland, it's an open carry state where you can carry assault rifles walking down the street. But a young boy who's playing with an airsoft BB gun was killed within a couple seconds of the encounter with police officers. And people are still waiting for answers for that. So we're sharing this because this is what we've been shown on social media, this is what we've been shown on TV, and this is what makes people very emotional. And it should. People should be angry about this. But this isn't the only thing that the black community, this is the only type of oppression that the black community faces in America. There's other things that they face. For example, stop and frisk. The controversial stop and frisk practice in all over America, but particularly is infamous in New York. According to the New York Civil Liberties Union, from 2005 till present time, there was over 5 million New Yorkers stopped during a stop and frisk encounter. And at the height of this, at the height of the stop and frisk era in 2011, more than 685,000 people were stopped on the street. This graph is showing you the percentages of those people who were innocent. 51% of them were black, 33% of them were Latino, and only 9% of them were white. The 7% accounts for the other ethnic groups, so like Indians and Chinese, for example. And this actually brings something to mind. It's very similar to, because we all, I'm pretty sure if you came here, we all together stand in opposition to apartheid systems all over the world. And this actually is very similar to what's going on in apartheid Israel, because these people are stopped and harassed while they're walking down the street. They're stopped and terrorized while they're going to work, are doing everyday things that normal people do. The only difference is there is no checkpoints. And this also brings to mind this picture that was given to me by a brother who went to New York to marry his sister in Brooklyn, and he shared with me this picture to actually show me what's going on. This is a New York City Police Department vehicle, and it's a surveillance vehicle. You can see it's stationed, the tires are off the ground, and the booth jacks up, and this vehicle has the capability of x-raying through buildings, x-raying through police, through vehicles, and x-raying through your clothing. And they're not there because somebody called them to say that the crime is about to be committed. They're not there because they have evidence of a crime will be committed. They're there to establish a presence, to let people know that we're here and we're watching you. And this is why he told me when he speak to everyday people on the street in New York, in Brooklyn, all throughout the boroughs, they really feel like they're under occupation. And over here in Canada, we're lucky that we don't have to deal with a lot of the racially biased practices by police on the same scale as our southern neighbors. But that doesn't mean that we don't face our own problems. The Toronto Star compiled some data ranging from 2009 to 2014, And in 2011, they showed that in Brampton and Mississauga, under the controversial practice as carding, which was a big controversy, even here in Hamilton. In Brampton, the street checks, 21% of those people who were stopped were black, when black people only made up 9% of that population, versus whites who made up 28% of those people were stopped when they made up 41% of that city's population. So racial disparities exist here. And nationwide, the Toronto Star also compiled some data showing us that if you're black, you have 3 times more of a chance of being stopped on the street than you do if you're a white. So, like I said, racial disparities exist here. It's actually a common phenomenon in Western countries. So going back to Black America, if they don't stop you while you're walking down the street, chances are they're going to get you while you're driving under what's called a pretext stop, where they stop you for maybe your taillight's out. What they're really trying to do is try to see what's going on in your car. So they ask you invasive questions about yourself or your car. They try to get some permission to get in your car and to search. And these are 13 jurisdictions in America that keep records on how much more likely black people are to be searched while they're on the side of the road. Chicago, if you're black, you're 5.2 times more likely to be searched on the side of the road. Torrington, Connecticut, 5 times more likely to be searched. And you can see New Haven, 2.9%, and it goes on, right? Out of these 13 jurisdictions, 12 out of these 13 jurisdictions, blacks are on average 20% less likely to have contraband on them while they're being searched. So it makes you wonder, like, why is there such a focus on them? Why do they face such heavy scrutiny, right? There's actually studies that show that whites are more likely to have on them contraband or a controlled substance, and they're more likely to use that controlled substance, more likely to sell a controlled substance, and more likely to develop a substance abuse disorder. So it's clear that, let's make something clear, that the war on drugs is a war on black people. Because if they cared about stopping drugs, they would go to places like Wall Street. They would police white communities the same way they police ethnic low-income communities. So once you get caught up in the system, once they get you either in a street check or they get you while you're driving, you have to face the court system and you have to somehow make up some bail. It's either bail or jail. Each year in New York specifically, 45,000 people are sitting in jail because they can't afford it to get out. Even when bail is set at $500 or less, like it is in 2/3 of non-felony cases, only 15% of people manage to bail out. To put this into perspective, out of 2.2 million people currently incarcerated in America today, only 1 in 10 of them are under federal control. The rest of them are spread out in state prisons. Most of them are sitting in city and county jails waiting for resolution on their case or waiting to acquire enough money to bail themselves out. And out of those people sitting in jail, 60% of them are presumed innocent under the law. So that means they're just sitting there waiting for the prosecutor to deal with them, waiting somehow to get out of jail, or waiting to just plead out. But what happened is, faced with the harsh reality of sitting in jail for something minor, a non-violent offense, normally drug possession or something very petty, these people plead out because the prosecutors hit them with the book. They say, if you want to challenge the system, you're going to face 5 to 10 years. So overwhelming majority of the people plead out. 90 to 95% of people plead out. To show you how dependent prosecutors are on keeping people in jail and then making them plead out, the New York Criminal Justice Agency compiled some data showing that when people are held in custody, when they're not held in custody, the conviction rates for prosecutors are about 50% of the time. When they're held in custody, the convictions rate shoot up over 90%. So it's clear that setting bail at a high rate is used as a tool of compulsion, and making people mandatory minimum sentences is a tool of compulsion used to secure convictions. And all of this, street checks, being pulled over while you're driving, All of this is what keeps the prison system and the system of mass incarceration going. In 1970, there was approximately 300,000 people in jail, and at that time, it was considered to be a large number. And because of the shift of punitiveness in America, that number grew exponentially. It went over 2.2 million people. America now has 25% of the world's prison population, with only 5% of the world's total population. Out of those people sitting in jail today, 45% of them are blacks, when black people only make up approximately 14% of America's population. So we know, everybody knows that the system of mass incarceration is a problem. Everybody knows that blacks fill these jails, but how many people realize that how much of a role race plays in this? So I'll just ask the question. How many of you think today that slavery is dead? Just a quick show of hands, if you don't mind. Well, we know the story that we've been told. Slavery was abolished after the Civil War. We know that the 13th Amendment was credited for this, and which was formally abolished slavery. But the 13th Amendment has one major exception in it that explains what's happening today. And it reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment of crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction." So that's the major exception. Today, if you're convicted of a crime, you are a slave of the state. Slavery is still alive and well in America. Not only does this have major implications on the criminal justice system as a whole and mass incarceration, it actually explains what's going on today. Like, for example, what's going on in Angola prison. Angola prison used to be a plantation in the era of slavery, in the era of convict leasing, and it's still there today. So, and also, all of this explains the push for black disenfranchisement. There are more people, more blacks, barred from voting today than there was in 1875, years after the 15th Amendment was ratified, to say that people won't be blocked from voting on account of their skin. And that's not all this disenfranchisement people have to deal with. Thanks to the 1994 crime bill passed by the Clinton administration, if you're convicted of a crime, public housing is off limits for you. If you're convicted of a crime, food stamps are off limits for you. If you're convicted of a crime, federal aid for education is also off limits for you. So what are the people to do faced with all these obstacles? How are they supposed to break through all these obstacles? The better question is, what is the system designed to do? 70% of people who get out of jail will find themselves back in jail within 3 years. And that's pretty frightening. And that number is steadily growing. So we've been through racial disparities in police practices, in court system with the prosecutors. But why is this happening? Why is there such a focus on race? And why are black people the focus of this criminal justice system? Is it just a matter of individual bias? Well, a lot of people, when they talk about this issue, they say it's about racism and it manifests itself structurally. But we got to go deeper than that. The real reason why this is happening is, we'll try to prove here today, it's really all about the 1%. It's about the elites who are afraid of the unification of the working class, of the unification of both whites and blacks, who will do anything, will sacrifice whoever they need to sacrifice in order to secure the hierarchy, the capitalist hierarchy. And there's 3 major instances in American history that illustrate this. But before we get there, we're gonna have to understand what America was before America became what it is today. And this is a quote by Laurent Bennett Jr., a black scholar in America, that shows us this. Blacks and whites didn't always hate each other. And he says in his quote, "Back there, before Jim Crow, before the invention of the Negro or the white man or the words and concepts to describe them, the colonial population consisted largely of a great mass of white and black bondsmen who occupied roughly the same economic category." So right there, he's establishing that it was about class. race didn't really matter. They didn't primarily define themselves by the color of their skin. It was about if you were poor or you weren't poor. And they were treated with equal contempt by the lords of their plantation and the legislators. So the rich people at the time, again, they didn't care if you're white or black. They hated you because if you were poor or not. Curiously unconcerned about their color, these people worked together and relaxed together. But all this changed after a major event, which was the Bacon's Rebellion. The Bacon's Rebellion, which had Jamestown, Virginia almost burnt to the ground, was set off by Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon was a white property owner in Jamestown, Virginia, who went to the elites at the time, the plantation owners, and tried to secure some resources and some militia support to take some lands from the indigenous people. But when they rejected him and they said that we're not going to help you, he turned around and he went to the poor black men, the poor white men, the slave and the indentured servant, and he managed to unite them all. And they went and they started attacking plantations and they started attacking the homes of the plantation owners. And he would rile them up and he would say things like, the poverty of the country is such that all the power and sway has gone into the hands of the rich, who by extortionate advantages, having the common people in their debt, have always curbed and oppressed them in all manner of ways. This rebellion was put down through false promises and promise of amnesty. Then, because of this is what caused the racial divide in America. This shook the elites at the time to the core. They realized that they were sleeping at the wheel. They realized that they allowed a coalition of whites and blacks, poor working whites and blacks, to get together, and they took steps to make sure that this wouldn't happen again. Some of the things that they did, they gave privileges to whites, what's called racial bribes. They gave the whites lands, they gave them the ability to police the slaves, and all of this put into the minds of the free white man whose position in society was not that much greater than the slaves themselves. And this helped secure a system based on race. And then we know what happened. The Civil War went on, and slavery was abolished. And what we know come to happen, the Reconstruction era. During this era, there was three major philosophies that are put forward: liberalism, conservatism, and radicalism. It was that last philosophy, radicalism, that the populist movement adopted. And the populist movement was heavily critiquing the rich elites at the time from both the North and the South. And this was the most promising for poor people, both white and black. And they would say things like, you are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. You are made to hate each other because upon this hatred is rested the keystone of the arch of financial despotism, which enslaves you both. You are deceived and blinded that you may see how this race antagonism perpetuates a monetary system which beggars both. So he's telling, this is Thomas Watson, a key figure in the populist movement, and he formed a coalition of both poor and working, both poor white and working black working class people. And he's telling that the real problem is that you're being separated, you're made to hate each other, and while you are at each other's neck, you're being exploited by the elites at the time. So again, just like the Bacon's Rebellion, this movement was a poor people's movement who managed to unite the races. And this man actually sold out because of a lot of the pressure that was put on him by the conservatives at the time. And he ended up rejoining the conservatives. And because of this, a new system of control was imposed on the people, which was Jim Crow. And we know how long Jim Crow lasted. It lasted for about half a century. And a lot of people credit the Brown versus Board of Education for the fall of Jim Crow. But a lot of legal scholars disagree with this. They said the beginning of the end of Jim Crow was credited to World War II and the presence of another ideological power, which was communism at the time. Because America, as it presented itself to the world, it presented itself as a free and just society. communism gave a promise to people, especially blacks, of a more egalitarian state, because under communism, race didn't really matter. So it was because of this momentum that was given to the civil rights movement that helps the civil rights movement secure a lot of social and political reforms. But just like the Bacon's Rebellion and just like the populist movement, the civil rights movement shifted to a poor people's movement. It was about class issues, as we've seen at the later stages of Martin Luther King's life. He would say, for him, it was after he won a lot of social and political reforms. For him, it was more about changing the system, because he realized that this problem of race could not be fixed just through reforms. He would say things like, true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. So he's saying we need to change this thing that produces racism. We need to change this thing that produces poverty, that exploits black people. And this was a reason for the major backlash against desegregation and the civil rights movement altogether. In 1968, there was a Gallup poll conducted that posed a question to the people that said, do you agree that law and order have broken down in America? 81% of those people that took this Gallup poll agreed, and they said that they blamed Negro and communists for starting the problems in society and a lot of the riots. So what does this really mean? What they're really saying is that they had enough of black people pushing too fast and too far ahead, and something needed to be done to rein black people in. Then the civil rights movement was started to be painted as criminal. Traditional crimes of an economic or a violent nature were not distinguished from what the civil rights movement were doing and their style of peaceful civil disobedience. Just like what was happening around the same time with Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party was known to carry their guns around, but they were protected against behind the Second Amendment. And just like today, what's happening with Black Lives Matter. If a cop is killed, a lot of people, they say it's Black Lives Matter's fault. If we hear that huge controversy when people say pigs in a blanket, that was a major thing that was used against Black Lives Matter, even though they had nothing to do with it. Or even somebody, an angry youth is yelling against the cops, they say it's all Black Lives Matter's fault. This was being pushed forward a lot from the conservative Republican side. And the Republicans, knowing that white people had enough of what was called the Second Reconstruction for the black community, instituted the Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy exploited white backlash against desegregation. They knew that the whites were angry with the democratic support of civil rights movement and desegregation, because the South was a democratic stronghold from all the way from the FDR time, the Democratic New Deal, up until the Southern Strategy was implemented. And this is what accounts for the major realignment of the South. And they did this by using dog whistle politics, racially coded rhetoric. They would say things that only a racist would understand and a racist would appreciate. And for example, one of the examples was Ronald Reagan in his campaign, and he would go to Mississippi, a state where 3 civil rights activists were murdered, and he would say, we support state rights. That's a not so subtle way of saying that we support you in your fight against desegregation. Or the 1968 presidential campaign, where 2 Republican candidates, Barry Goldwater and Nixon, focused their entire campaign on establishing law and order in America. This is actually, all of this is implicitly racist, and is very similar to Stephen Harper did in last year's election against Muslims. This is a flyer that was circulating around here in Hamilton, and the last point says, we're protecting you, as you can see, against jihadi terrorists. We know what he's saying here. He's saying to his base voters, we're protecting you against Muslims. Because in in Canada, you have more chance of being killed by a police officer than being killed by jihadi terrorists. You have more chance of being killed by a dog bite than you have of being killed by jihadi terrorists. So we know what he's trying to say there. So going back to Black America, after the Southern strategy, the problem once again became the blacks. Before the Southern strategy, in 1950s, 1960s, the white Americans, if they were down and out, they blamed the economic system for all their problems. But after the Southern strategy, if you were down and out, it was your fault, and it wasn't the fault of the greater society. And if you're black and you were poor, it's because you weren't working hard enough, and it was your own fault. And you need to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. So this was blow after blow to the black community. Then came the major one, the war on drugs. Reagan rode into the White House with the full support of angry whites from the South, and he wanted to keep his promise that he would get tough on them, meaning he would get tough on the black community, and he declared his war on drugs in 1982. At the time when he declared his war, only 2% of Americans felt like America actually had a drug problem. They felt like drugs were a pressing issue. But he didn't declare this war because there was actually a problem of drugs at the time. He declared this war to keep a promise. He wanted to make sure that the people that they managed to make defect from the Democratic side to the Republican side would stay Republican, and they would stay loyal to the Republican Party. Soon after he declared the drug war, in 1985, crack hit the streets. And we know of the devastation crack caused in the black and brown communities. But right after drug hit the street, the media were running shots of black crack addicts, what crack did to black and brown communities. And this helped pretty much overnight Reagan secure funding for his new war on drugs. So when he launched this war, pretty much overnight, the funding was reallocated from white-collar crime to street crime, which normally the federal government had no part to play in previous the war on drugs. So the FBI's funding shot up from 8 million to 95 million, practically overnight. The Department of Defense went from 33 million to over $1 billion, versus how they went about treating drug addiction and treating what drugs does to people. The National Institute for Drug Abuse funding went from 274 million to 57 million. And the Department of Defense went from 14 million to 3 million. So they really had a plan, and they did everything they did for a reason. Right after the war, the following year, in '86, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed by Reagan. This is the act that introduced mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenses. Under this act, if you had 5 grams of crack cocaine on you, which, as we know, crack cocaine is prevalent in poor communities, and if you had 5 grams of crack cocaine on you, you'd face a mandatory minimum of 5 years. To get the equivalent sentence, you would have to have 500 grams of cocaine on you. And we know people in the hood, they can't afford 500 grams of cocaine. So this is all racist by intent, and we see this, right? So just a quick recap what we went through. We went through how the police practice, their practices are racially biased, and we went through how the problem is not just a matter of individual bias. The problem is poor versus rich, and they use race to divide people, and they use race to keep people at each other's neck while maintaining their hierarchy. So in this fight, when it comes to the war on drugs, clearly the enemy has been racially defined. The system of mass incarceration, coupled with a war on drugs, helps relegate entire communities to a second-class status. And it disenfranchises entire community, making America effectively an apartheid state. And this is because capitalism, like I said, creates a world where people don't like each other, they hate each other based on the color of their skin. and it divides the rest of us while they maintain their power. And they're willing to sacrifice anybody and everybody to do this. So example of this is when, right after Bacon's Rebellion, when they wanted to institute slavery, they were thinking about how are we going to do this? Who are we going to enslave? So they asked themselves, are we going to enslave the indigenous people? And they said no, because they were fighting indigenous people at the time, and they realized we couldn't enslave them because they're not going to obey us. They're going to continue to fight us. So they asked themselves, are we going to enslave the Europeans, the immigrants? And they went against this because that would stop the Europeans from voluntarily immigrating to America and making land and farming. And they settled on the black people because the blacks had no support at the time. They had nobody to help them. And if they had any other opportunity to do this to indigenous people or the European people, they would have done this. And they wouldn't have thought twice about this. And they knew what they were doing. Just like Thomas Jefferson, who was American president, who was a major capitalist himself, and he also was an owner of slaves. Before his death, he would say things like, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. So he knew what he was doing, and he knew that after he was dead, that he would have to face his actions. So what does that mean for us? Where does that leave us faced with this unjust world, and what do we need to do to face all these problems? So that's my talk, and thank you for listening.